This is the Smart Buildings Academy podcast with Phil Zito, episode 215. Hey folks, Phil Zito here, and welcome to episode 215 of the Smart Buildings Academy podcast. And in this episode, we are going to be talking through onboarding new BAS professionals. And this episode is sponsored by our online building automation skills assessment. If you have employees, either new hires or existing hires, and you are trying to identify skill gaps, that way you can manage their learning and development path, then you definitely want to check out our online skill assessment. It will give you clear, quantifiable data that defines skill gaps across multiple different technical domains for your employees. So feel free to go to smartbuildingsacademy.com and check that out. And this episode is going to be at podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/215, where you'll also find a link to our online skill assessment. So what is this concept of onboarding? I've had the fortune of working for very small companies, working for mid-sized companies, and working for Fortune 100s. And across that experience, I've seen all forms of onboarding. I've seen onboarding that has been so formalized to the point where it's not effective. It's literally just doing a checklist, and there's no real emotion behind it. It's very robotic, and you really don't get to know your employees. On the other hand, I've seen onboarding which is literally like, oh, thank God you're here. Here's the tools. We need you on the job site because we're getting yelled at by the GC. And, neither of those really work quite effectively. The problem is that they really don't understand the employee as an individual and what that employee's strengths and weaknesses are, what their learning style is, what their motivational styles are. And I know that may seem kind of touchy-feely, but the reality is you can get the most out of your employees when you understand their motivational styles, when you understand what makes them tick, whether they learn visually, whether they learn kinesthetically, whether they learn by hearing or doing, all these things that at the beginning of that employee journey, you have the opportunity to really understand and shape the development of that employee. And why would you want to do that? Well, statistically, it's shown that having a clear onboarding process reduces your time to profitability by 62%. 62%. So if the average technician, you hear all sorts of numbers thrown around, 2 years, 1 year, 18 months. If the average technician, let's just land in the middle there, takes 18 months to get really profitable, and you cut that by half, then you're taking a technician that's 18 months to be on the job doing stuff on their own, and you're making them fully effective, fully utilized, fully profitable within 9 months. So you're essentially eliminating 9 months of margin degradation, 9 months of not really fully utilizing that technician or that programmer against backlog. That's 9 months of not having to charge the overhead. Those are all highly beneficial things to the profitability of your business. But there's a softer side of this as well in how it engages your employees. It keeps your employees loyal, keeps them constantly developing, which enables you to do higher level work, which is increasingly more profitable. So there's so many benefits to onboarding, yet it is really often an afterthought. So let's talk through how onboarding traditionally works. This is going to be pretty short how it traditionally works because it's traditionally a pretty short process. You get the new technician, whether it is someone moving into a new role or it's a new hire, and you put them through the HR stuff, right? You have them watch the safety videos, go through the diversity checklists, go through their compliance checklists, get their IT gear set up, get their phone set up, their purchase card if they have one, their truck, all of that. And that takes anywhere from 1 to 3 days. You get them tooled up and kitted out. They go with a senior tech to Granger, grab their stuff, or maybe you have a process where you actually have a kit at Grainger or wherever you're buying parts from, and that kit is automatically pre-purchased. Doesn't matter. They get their stuff, and then by the end of the week, you're rolling them out to a site and you're sticking them under a senior tech, and you're hoping they learn the same way you learned, which was on-the-job experiential training, which can be very effective, but can also be very not effective because you're at the mercy of several things, one of which, can the senior tech even train? Senior tech may be really good at what they do. They may be really poor at passing that information on to someone else, as well as going and taking that information that they have, right? That process and skill and understanding, not only being able to pass that on, do they have that ability, but do they have the time to do that? See, therein lies the other challenge, is that having the time to actually go and teach someone and teach them effectively can be quite challenging. And the third thing is, do they have a process for teaching and developing this person? Because it's one thing to have the time. It's another thing to have the ability, but then you have to have a process, because you can be bouncing all over the place. One day you may be teaching that technician how to download controllers, just assuming they understand the basic fundamentals of MSTP, assuming they know the basic fundamentals of supervisory devices. So there's so many underlying knowledge sets that are required in order to properly teach and explain processes to folks. Which brings us to a new model for onboarding. And this is going to look a little different. One thing I really encourage you to do before you ever do any model for onboarding, and we're going to go through a couple different models, but before you do any form of onboarding, I really encourage you to map out your current employee life cycle. And what do I mean by this? Well, I want you to look at an employee or the employees that you've hired. And I want you to ask yourself a couple questions. One, are you losing employees? Like, are they quitting? Are they retiring? What's going on? When are you losing them in the employee life cycle? Do you get folks who come in straight out of high school, straight out of trade school, and they work with you for 20, 30 years? Great. Is that what you want? Do you want folks working with you 20, 30 years in the same role, or are you expecting them to gradually work their way up into management? What is the employee life cycle? When are they leaving your organization, and how are they moving through your organization? Which brings us to the next question. Are employees getting stuck in development cycles? So the natural progression for someone coming into our industry is usually they work in construction, and they will work under a senior tech, and then from construction they will have a choice. They can either move into design, and then move into programming, and then move into integration or project management. That's one path. That's typically the construction path. The other path is they can move from technician in construction to technician in service to senior service tech, and then basically lead service tech, right? Those are the two main paths. Now there is a sales path as well, but those are the two main paths for technical staff. So you have to ask yourself, are people getting stuck in development cycles? And then you have to ask yourself, why are they getting stuck in development cycles? If your goal is to do commercial real estate work and you are teaming for that, then your team structure is going to look completely different than if you're doing like tier 4 data centers or high-end hospitals. The staff and technical capabilities of your team are going to look different. So commercial real estate, you may be fine staffing heavily with technicians and light with designers and programmers, because most of the programming and designing you're going to do is for plan and spec repeatable projects. Whereas with healthcare, you may be better off stacking light on technicians and stacking heavy on programmers, because most of what you're going to do is going to be complex programming and complex troubleshooting. So understanding the vertical markets you serve, understanding your strategic growth goals, understanding how you want to deploy your team is really important. Once you understand that, though, then you can identify the development cycles that your team runs in. You could say, okay, most of our folks are technicians, but they're 5-year techs. And you talk to these people and they want to move out of the tech role, but they're not. What is the barrier? And so this brings in another strategic decision, which is creating thresholds and criterion for moving across those threshold barriers, right? So the threshold from a technician to a designer, from a designer to a programmer, from a programmer to an integrator, those should have clearly defined tasks, and those task lists, and that's something we provide our customers when we onboard our customers, our corporate customers. We provide a task list to help them identify what tasks their different employees should be able to do in order to move into specific roles, because we find a lot of small to medium-sized organizations do not have that structure. But that's something you want to establish, and then you say, okay, if they don't have this, what do they need to do to get that? And I will tell you, from my perspective, having ran a $60 million P&L with 22 technicians and running, gosh, man, it was like 120 projects at a time. I will tell you it is a lot easier to develop people at the beginning and the end of their development cycles than it is in the middle. What do I mean by that? If you have a new hire technician, it's a lot easier to do an assessment, understand their gaps, and then close those gaps in the beginning. And then do another assessment right before you bring them. You're saying, oh, this technician has some talent. I want them to move into a designer role. Then do another assessment, or take the existing assessment and just redo it and run them through that. Figure out, okay, these are the gaps they're missing for a designer, so I'm going to take them out of the field and I'm going to put them through an intensive in a designer. That is, in my experience, the most effective way of employee development. I want to repeat that for a second because it's something you don't see a lot, but it's something that's highly effective. You will see it, though, in a lot of IT organizations, which is interesting. But what I'm saying is you take the employee, you bring them on, you identify their gaps, and then you train them to close those gaps so they can do their role. When they're getting ready to move into a new role, you then take them back out again, do an assessment, close those gaps again, do an intensive at the end of their technician life cycle to move them into that designer life cycle. And by doing this, you're reducing learning on the job, or you're mitigating learning on the job as much as you can. I don't want to say you're eliminating learning on the job, because there will always be OJT, on-job training. However, the more you can mitigate that with core underlying skills, the more profitable and the more proficient your team will be. So, right, you want to know why you're losing your employees, what their life cycle is, and where they're getting stuck in development cycles. And then you want to identify, and really, I guess you could have done this first, identify your strategic goals for your organization. You want to understand, what are your growth goals? What does your team structure need to be in order to execute those growth goals? You know, a $100 million team is going to look completely different than a $10 million team, and is going to look completely different than a $1 million team. So depending on what you want your revenue to be each year, which is a good static measurement of strategic goals for your organization, I tend to find companies will be like, I want 3 branches, and I want each branch to have this many people. And you say, okay, that's great, but what do you want your revenue to be? Because having branches just for the sake of having branches and having people just for the sake of having people is not necessarily a good strategic goal. You want to understand, what vertical market are you serving? What revenue targets are you looking for? At what % margin do you want to execute that revenue? And how much of that executed margin do you want going back in your business? So you could say effectively, I want to do 10 million a year, and I want to do that at, 12% margin, but I am willing to accept my executed margin at 10%. Because I realize that to step into this new vertical market, maybe I'm shifting from commercial real estate to K through 12, or I'm shifting from commercial real estate to healthcare. to go and address that new market, I'm going to have a learning curve, and I'm going to have to pull my guys out and gals out and train them in order to execute this new vertical market and the nuances with it. And that's going to go and cause some margin reduction. And you can reasonably accept that. But it all starts by understanding your revenue targets, understanding the verticals you want to serve, those kind of things. Once you understand this, then you can say, okay, how do I want to develop my talent bench? How do I want to structure my team in order to execute these strategic goals? Does that mean that I need more technicians now than I've had in the past? Because I'm going to go after the real estate market, or I'm going to go after the K through 12 market? Or do I need more programmers because I want to shift to more institutional markets? I want to shift to data center markets. I want to shift to healthcare markets. Understanding this will go and drive how you develop your talent bench. With all this being said, the model I recommend for onboarding is I guess you could say it's like a 6-7 step model. The steps flux and flex based on your organizational structure. But what I like to look at is I look at a process that takes about 2 to 3 weeks for onboarding. And I know some of you are cringing. You're hearing that. You're like, but Phil, I've got backlog to execute now. The economy just opened back up, or we just won this huge job. I need to execute this backlog. And I understand that. I totally do. I get the pressure from GCs yelling at you. Why aren't you on this job? You told me you could complete the job. There's liquidated damages. We're going to bill you. We're going to charge you. We don't want to wait for certificate of occupancy because of you. Darn controls people holding up everything again. I totally get it. And they usually don't use that nice of language. I understand the pressure you're under. However, you will always be under that kind of pressure. And increasingly, my experience has been that pressure will just increase if you don't have a process and you keep doing things reactionary. If you react instead of being proactive, you will go and find that you are still getting that pressure. Because let's be honest, you take a brand new technician, you stick them out on a job site to go and just execute backlog because the GC's yelling at you. That technician messes up, reverses all the valve polarity, or doesn't properly terminate some sensors. And next thing you know, now the T&B folks and the commissioning folks are coming after and saying, oh, look at the punch list. Oh, darn controls folks messed everything up again. And you're still in the same position you are. If you had just taken a little bit more time and properly onboarded that person, you could have gotten slightly ahead of the curve. And it's micro increments that add up over time that make you able to be more process driven, more profitable, and more ahead of the curve. So the onboarding checklist, right? There's always complete the HR requirements. I mean, I'm not going to get into that with you too deeply because it's pretty straightforward, right? It's all of your tax documentation, all of your policy documentation, etc. It usually takes 1 to 2 days. The good news is if you've got a signed offer letter, you can sometimes get ahead of that and complete a lot of that before even starting the onboarding process. Now, next up, what I like to do, and granted, we do have a solution for doing this through our online skill assessments, but you can do this yourself, is to perform a role-based assessment. And it's really important that it is a role-based assessment. It's an assessment that is going to test the skills of that person based on what they're going to be doing in their role. And this is really important for 2 reasons. One, a role-based assessment should include some psychological questions, things like how are you motivated, how do you best learn, what is most important to you. These are things that you as a manager can then use to understand how do I motivate my employees, how do I guide my employees, how do I assist in their development. But it should also have role-based questions. So it should be asking questions specific for a technician to electrical, to I/O, to controllers, to field buses, to IT, to HVAC, to programming. Some of the basic programming aspects, right? Just understanding basic logic, because oftentimes you have to do some field modifications, even as a technician. Understanding the results of these assessments, right, is going to be very important to you as a manager. Now, before you review these results with your employee, I highly recommend, and this is something I also don't see done a lot, review role expectations. Here at my company, every week we have a meeting where we discuss our goals, our strategic goals, and our weekly goals, and we go through, all right, what's most important? What should we be focusing on? And that is built back into our role expectations. So when someone comes on board to the company, first off, we complete the HR stuff. Then we assess them based on what they know. And we go through the expectations of the role and our company processes. And then based on those role expectations and company processes, we then review the assessment results. And we do that within the context of the role requirements. Now, granted, we're a training provider, so our assessment process, our expectation process looks different than what yours would. But I did this back when I was running an operations team as well, which looked very similar to what you're going through. So I would go and say, okay, this is what I know about you based on what I asked. And because at the time I didn't have a formal tool to do it, I just used questions. And I would say, this is the role expectations, here's our processes, and then I'd say, based on what I've learned from talking to you, here's where I think you have areas for development, and they tie into these aspects of your role. So, if I found someone was very weak electrically, but they were strong with HVAC and they were strong with controls, then I would say, okay, my expectations of you as a technician are this, and we know that you tested kind of poorly in this area. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to look at your professional development plan, which you should have for your employees, and your year one goals. And we are going to align the results from the assessment to your development plan. We're going to set up markers for 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, where we're going to remeasure what you know. Now, I know as a manager, you're like, man, this is freaking a lot of work. But if you do this, then you are now managing and you're not out in the field doing the work. Because let's be honest, how many of you as managers are really your technical leaders and you're going out into the field because your guys and gals can't figure out that Modbus integration, or they can't figure out how to do this wiring scheme with that 4-to-20 sensor. And because of that, you're actually out in the field. You're not leading a business. There's, working on your business and working in your business. And as a manager, you want to be working on your business. And to do that, you need to set up these development plans with concrete, quantifiable measurements that you can then use to drive development. So once you have those, right, you've established your benchmark measurements and you've established your touch point cadence, then I highly recommend you assign quick hit skill gap training. So this is training that can be done, and it can be done in 1 to 2 weeks, and it will close the gaps on whatever skill gaps your employees have. Now, you can do this by having a professional training team in-house, and you can go and create your own training and create your own training processes. I've seen some companies do that. You have companies like our company that do this for you, which we do the assessment and we do the training, and we help you close those gaps, and then we help you to continue training that person over the period of their first year. Whichever way you choose to do that, just have some process. I would highly recommend, unless you are higher than 100 million in revenue a year, I really cannot recommend developing your own training organization. The cost and time to do that is extensive, and the skill sets required are extensive. I would rather you take that, $1 million to $2 million it's going to cost to develop a training company, apply that to profitability and growth. That is, in my opinion, your best success strategy. Once you have done that, though, once you've closed the gaps with that skill gap training, then you release them to the project, and you're going to see a phenomenally different result. I know I'm using some nice, colorful, big language, but I cannot tell you enough I can't emphasize enough how much impact it will have on the profitability and proficiency of your employees to follow this process. This is something that very few, I don't want to say very few, a good portion of companies do not do. And then they wonder why they're stuck under 10 million in revenue for year after year after year, because they don't create a process, they don't have a strategy, and they don't run their business like a system. Because at the end of the day, your business is a system of systems, and you run those systems, and the systems have direct feedback loops, and you use the feedback loops from those systems to incrementally improve performance and to drive profitability. At the end of the day, if you are not profitable and you are not bringing cash in the business, your business will die. And one of the best ways to be profitable is to have technicians, programmers, designers who get the job done the right way the first time, within cost constraints, within time frame constraints. And in my experience, the best way to do that is to properly onboard and develop those employees. I hope that this podcast episode has been informative. I've hoped that it's given you a different perspective on how to approach things, how to go about taking your talent from the starting journey to the end, and really gives you some tools that you can apply to your business right now. At podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/215, there will be a short onboarding checklist that you can download. Feel free to go download that. I'm sure my marketing people want me to put that behind an email, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to have it as a PDF on the webpage. So, I mean, literally just go to podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/215. You'll see the PDF download link, and you can click on that. I'm not promising you it's going to be anything fancy, but just go download that, build upon it, and utilize it. Remember that progress, not perfection. I see so many people who they get these ideas and then they try to do it all at once and they get really down on themselves. Just a little bit. Even if you just implement an assessment and you implement a professional development plan, you are already ahead of the curve, because at least you know what your people know and don't know, and you have a development plan for them. I really recommend you follow this entire process, but even if you just do that, you will be very far ahead of the curve. So I hope this podcast was helpful to you. We're going to be doing a couple more weeks worth of kind of management and strategy podcasts, and then we're going to shift back to the technical podcasts. All right, folks, thanks a ton for listening, and I look forward to talking to you next week. If you have any questions, please go to the comments, ask them there. I'd love to answer them for you. Thanks a ton, and take care.